to this. Yes, and it's recording to this computer, which is exactly where I want it to be. And I just have to, now I have to move the captions for a minute. Okay, we have started recording, so I'll just go ahead and go ahead. Go ahead, okay. Hang on, I gotta find my words, so sorry. Okay, well, here we are. Good morning and welcome to ACTviaZoom for January 29th. I'm Carol Sullivan and I'm filling in today for Wendy Pierce. Please remember to put your audio on mute, although I think Cindy may have done that for you already. And using those three little dots in the right-hand corner of your picture in the gallery and the pull-down menu that you get when you click on it, if you could put your county so that we can see where you're zooming in from this morning, that would be nice. It's nice to see league members and guests from across the state. And we are here this morning to learn what even year elections might offer to voters in Washington. And we're going to be welcoming Andrew Villeneuve. Andrew, you're going to have to say your name because I kept trying to do it Spanish, but I'm not sure how you say it here. Villanova.
Villeneuve is the French
English
pronunciation.
Yeah, I was trying to put a Spanish spin on it. It wasn't anyway. Okay. He's the founder and director of Northwest Progressive Institute. And for over 2 decades, Andrew's been advancing progressive causes. It's a long time. He doesn't look like it, but for a long time, he's been very busy. In addition to being a cybersecurity expert, he's a strategist, a speaker, an author, and an organizer. I found out he was also a delegate to the Democrat National Convention for Barack Obama in 2012 and for Bernie Sanders in 2016. Now, all of this is very impressive, but there's really lots more on Andrew's resume. But you know, Andrew, what struck me the most was that your involvement began when you were in junior and senior high school in Redmond. And in 2005, Andrew was awarded the Redmond Mayor's Circle of Leadership Award for his community involvement. So that's about 20 years ago, and he'd already done enough to be recognized by his community. I also learned that it was Tim Eyman's initiatives that pushed Andrew into state and regional politics. So today, Andrew's here to share with us what a change in the election frequency might mean for our voters. But I need to note that the Democracy Team and the League of Women Voters have not endorsed even year elections, and that at another time, we will be sharing the other side of the story, the impact on election offices. But this is really a topic that you're hearing about now, and it's important to get information from a very well-informed source, and that is Andrew. So our thanks for being here today, Andrew, and the spotlight is now on you. Cindy, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, please. I
Thank
just wanted to let people know too that I put in the chat a link to our studies and our positions. And the league has a lot of studies you'll see in this chat, and we can't study everything, but we don't take position, we don't act and make advocacy unless we do have done a study. It's a 2-year study. We look at all the research out there. We do pros and cons. We reach member consensus. So it's a very time consuming process. But like Carol said, we're neutral on this. We're not opposed to it or against it because we don't have a study. And I know Andrew has lots of research, and so we're really happy that he's able to be here to explain to us and that you can ask questions about that later. So thank you very much, Andrew and Carol.
And Andrew, before you start, do you want questions in the order that they might appear in the chat, or do you want to wait until after you've given us all the information to take questions?
I think let's try to get through the prepared material, and then we'll take whatever questions people have in the order they've asked them.
Okay, thank you.
And I want to thank you, Carol and Cindy, for that introduction. And hello to all of you league members. I'm a big fan of the league. I've been impressed with the league's forums and its careful, thoughtful policy recommendations for a long time. And of course, we've worked with the league on ballot access and voting justice reforms for many years. And I think together we've made Washington one of the easiest states in the country to vote in, which we should be very proud of. National studies do show that Washington and Oregon have the lowest barriers to participating in an election, and it would be really great if the rest of the country could follow our lead. But we have a chance to continue being leaders, and I think we should take that chance. I'm going to share my screen and we'll go through this whole even year elections question, because we have even year elections already. So it's important to note that when we are talking about even year elections, what we're really talking about is even year elections for localities, because we do have them already for state and federal positions. So Carol, Cindy, can you verify that the slides are now sharing correctly?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just start by giving you a little bit of an overview of our election system in the US. For some of you, this might be a little bit of a refresher. You might already know this information. And for those of you who are less familiar with the system and the history, this will hopefully be illuminating. So we can say that in the United States, elections are a patchwork system because of the design and structure of this republic. We don't have a unitary central government like many other democracies have. We have instead a federal system where power is shared between the states and the federal government. And because of that, all the 50 states do things a bit differently. Some examples are that some states have representative forms of government only, and others, like Washington, have a hybrid system, which includes direct democracy, and that means the initiative and referendum and also the recall. Some states use open primaries, others use closed primaries, and still others use top two jungle systems. And briefly, the difference is in a closed system, you have to be registered with a party to participate in their primary. In an open system, you don't have to be registered, but you have to pick a party. And in a top two jungle system, there are no party primaries. It's just a qualifying election. Some states use vote at home like us, most don't. If you're, for example, in Georgia, you're going to have to go to the polls most likely, and you might have to stand in a very long line. And they do have early voting there, but they don't have the vote at home system that we have. So election timing in the United States, interestingly enough, is a bit more standardized. And this is because of the Constitution and the federal Constitution, that is, and also state laws and state constitutions. But we're very calendar driven. In other countries, the government lasts for as long as the government can enjoy the confidence of its parliamentary body. But here in the United States, we run on the clock. So it's just like a gridiron game or a football game where you've got 4 quarters, and at the end of the 4 quarters, the game is over. Sports metaphor. So in the United States, every year is like a quarter of a football game, and you have a four quarters, right? So 4 years, and then you have another presidential election. In parliamentary countries, if you look at their systems, they will have what can be called snap general elections. And this is when the government decides that it would be advantageous to have an election, or the government has fallen apart because it lost a key vote, like the budget didn't pass because people didn't like what was in the budget. So that could create a no confidence motion, and then the government would be dissolved and they'd have a new election. We don't have that. So we're really fixed on the clock. If we use the parliamentary system, we would have already had a snap general election, because as you saw last fall, the US House could not agree on who should be the speaker, right? They couldn't agree at the beginning of Congress, and then they deposed McCarthy, and they couldn't figure out who they wanted to have as their speaker for a while. That would have triggered in a parliamentary system a general election. And we didn't have that because we are not a parliamentary system. The US Constitution dates all the way back to 1788. The first election for president was held a few weeks later. And so that's why we have our elections actually in even numbered years. So if you're wondering why are they in even years, not odd years? It's because of when we started. Now, the Constitution says the Congress may determine the time of choosing their electors and the day on which they shall give their votes, which day shall be the same throughout the US. So that's what the Constitution says about the timing. And here's what it says about elections for members of Congress. The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law or make or alter such regulations, except as the places of choosing senators. So then we get to federal law, because first you have the Constitution, that's your bedrock, and you can't change that easily. And then we have federal law sitting on top of that. So federal law says that election day means the Tuesday next after the first Monday in November, every 4 years, right? So this is the system, this is the clock that we're on. And it also says that that the state modifies the period of voting is necessitated by force majeure events that are extraordinary and catastrophic, as provided under the laws of the state enacted prior to such day. That is basically a clause that allows us to figure out what to do if there's some kind of national catastrophe. So they've actually given some thought to what should happen if election were to be disrupted, which is good to know. Now, congressional elections are similar. First Monday after in November is established as the day for the election. And then, of course, Congress starts up on the third day of January. So how did we end up voting in November? Well, Americans began the custom of weekday voting in 1845. That's when Congress passed a federal law that designated the first Tuesday following the first Monday, as you heard. Before then, states actually held elections anytime they pleased within a 34-day period. Why a Tuesday, though? The answer stems from the agrarian makeup of the country. Back in 1800s, that we were a very rural agricultural country. A lot of people lived far from their polling place. And since people travel at least a day to vote, lawmakers had to allow 2 days for election day. Weekends were not practical since most people spent Sunday in church, and Wednesday was market day for farmers. So that's how we ended up with Tuesday. Fascinating, huh? And so Tuesday got selected. Farm culture really drove this, and we've just sort of stuck to that because that's been our tradition. Spring and early summer elections were thought to interfere with planting season. Late summer and early fall elections overlapped with the harvest. So November became our election month. Most states align their state level elections with federal ones. 5 don't. Those states are shown here. These states have their state level elections in odd years: Virginia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, New Jersey. You probably hear about Virginia the most, and then maybe New Jersey second, and then maybe Kentucky third. I think Mississippi and Louisiana get the least national press, personally. But ththese are the 5 states that deviate from the national norm of having the states coincide with federal elections. In Washington, at the time we became a state, the United States has already been holding elections on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November for decades. So we opted at statehood to align our gubernatorial elections with presidential. The first gubernatorial election after Washington became a state was held in 1892. That was concurrent with the next presidential election after statehood. For most of our first 100 years, people voted principally just in the even-numbered years. Initiatives and referenda weren't even considered in odd-numbered years. And many localities also did their electing in even-numbered years. For example, in Seattle, for many years in the 20th century, Seattle was holding its municipal elections in March of even-numbered years. So the mayor of Seattle would get elected like in March of a presidential year. Beginning in the 1960s, the Washington State Legislature started making a lot of changes to our election timing system. Law was passed that forced all cities to hold their elections in odd years. By the early 1970s, the state also started holding state general elections in odd-numbered years. So they didn't stop holding them in even years, but they added odd years. So that meant that you could qualify an initiative or a referendum in an odd-numbered year, and it would be voted on that year. And part of the rationale for this was that these local contests wouldn't have to share a ballot with the higher profile federal and state contests. The theory is these local races benefit from standing on their own, no competition, don't get drowned out. And another reason was logistical. Washington has hundreds of cities, thousands of special districts, cemetery districts, water districts, fire districts, sewer districts, mosquito control districts. The list is long. Putting those into odd years created a cycle of elections with an annual cadence, and it reduced ballot length in the even-numbered years. But over 50 years of voter turnout data shows the experiment is not working. Most Washington voters actually don't want to vote every year, even though, as I said earlier, we've made it easier than anywhere else in the country to cast a ballot. We have all these things: same-day registration, more drop boxes, prepaid postage for ballot return envelopes, and a 3-week voting period. People get their ballot coming to them in the mail, but in odd-numbered years, most voters do not vote. We actually haven't seen majority turnout statewide in Washington in an odd year since 2011. And before that, often year turnout was typically bad, but now it's worse. When I first made this slide deck, we hadn't yet had the November 2023 general election. Now we have. The November 2023 general election was the worst in state history, surpassing November of 2017. So that's now the second worst turnout at 37.10. The worst turnout was last year at 36%. And then you have 2015, 2021, 2019, 2013. They all rank in the top 10 turnouts, the top 10 worst turnouts of all time. So the trend is bad, and it doesn't look like it's going to be getting any better. While odd year turnout has been falling, however, even year turnout has been healthy. 2020, we had near record turnout in Washington for a presidential year, surpassed really only by 2008. 2018 saw near record turnout in Washington for midterm. 2022 wasn't as high, but was still very decent and certainly a lot higher than an odd-numbered year. So this is our famous turnout by election type chart. Very busy chart, but every single line on here is a different kind of election. So at the top, you see the presidential elections are all plotted on one line. The yellow line in the middle is all the midterm elections plotted together. And then all those lines at the bottom that are all sort of mixed together are the local elections along with the presidential primary. So those, and also the top two elections. So each one of those lines is its own election type. So every 4 years, that kind of election repeats. And so like every 4 years, you have a presidential, every 4 years, you have a midterm, every 4 years, you have a local of the A type and then a local of the B type. A type would be like 2000 and 2021, 2020, 2025, that would be A type. 2027, that would be an example of B type. So there's just a difference between the two local cycles. So many cities stagger their terms, and some positions will come up in the A type and some come up in the B type. But this shows you all the turnouts plotted over time, and you can see that the local turnouts are all hanging out down here, the bottom half of the chart, and the even year turnouts are in a league of their own above them. So the upgrade is by moving to local elections to even years, we can both raise and diversify turnout. Our friend Zoli, that's his nickname, professor at UC San Diego, an expert on election timing, has been doing a lot of national research on this. And what they found is that even year elections for local governments double voter turnout. Even year elections increase the representativeness of turnout. They reduce Black, Latino, and Asian American underrepresentation. They cost less per voter to administer, and they make policy more responsive to everyone. Zoli writes, moving to on-cycle, meaning even year elections, is the single most effective change that local governments can undertake to increase turnout. No other rules change or procedural reform comes close. More polling places, early voting, modernized voter registration, and only reforms only raise turnout by a few points. But with even year elections for local governments, you can as much as double the turnout. And there's no other reform available that can do that. We have seen many studies published on election timing, and every single one has found that voter turnout gets higher and more diverse with the switch to even years. Those studies are available in case you'd like to read them. We also have found robust public support for this. A majority of Washingtonians we've surveyed agree that we should have elections for local positions in even years, and only a quarter disagree. There's another quarter who aren't sure. This is from a poll of 909 likely 2022 Washington state voters who were interviewed in the autumn of 2021. And so you can see the question there, should Washington state discontinue holding elections in odd-numbered years and instead require cities, counties, ports, school districts, and other local governments to hold their elections in even years when state and federal offices are also on the ballot? Every subsequent poll we've done, like in King County, Snohomish County, et cetera, has found that people support even year elections. So the findings are consistent. We also know from actual elections that this is popular. In 2022, almost 70% of voters in King County cast votes in favor of our charter amendment to move 12 county positions to elections in even years. So that would be executive, assessor, elections director, and 9 county council, all moving to even years, and almost 70% of voters voted for that change. Elsewhere in the United States in 2022, there were 12 other jurisdictions that also considered measures to adopt even year elections, and those all passed overwhelmingly. Some local positions are already chosen in even years, and they do benefit from higher turnout. So counties across Washington state are using even years already. King County is making a switch, and that just leaves Snohomish and Whatcom as the odd two out. So for those of you on the call who are from Snohomish and Whatcom, you're the only ones left by 2028 who will be electing their positions in odd years. Everyone else is in even years. In Seattle, we have a history of electing municipal court judges in even years, and strangely, those positions can get more votes than for mayor in an odd-numbered year. And that's because of the timing. Public utility districts. For those of you who are in rural Washington, you probably have a public utility district in your county, chances are, and people in King County may not know what a PUD is, but they're a very common type of local government elsewhere in Washington. And we already elect our public utility district commissioners in even-numbered years. PCOs, that's another example. Precinct committee officers. If you're involved in the Democratic or the Republican Party, you serve as a PCO, you run in an even numbered year. And those are perhaps the most local position that we have. Despite the popularity of even year elections with voters, though, there is opposition. Voters just love even year elections, as I said, and you can count on voters to approve a proposal to move to even year elections if they get one. But you're always going to hear concerns from a certain contingent, and that includes consultants, election administrators, and some others. There are some folks who like the current system and they've offered arguments in favor of keeping it. We're going to go through some of those arguments now. First argument that we hear is that drop-off will hurt down ballot races if they're on an even year ballot. So the thinking is, well, if the ballot is long, then when people get to the end of it, they're not going to be voting anymore. So that's a problem. We don't want those local races to suffer from that drop-off. But the data actually shows the opposite. Most voters will vote a complete ballot, even if it's on the longer side. Yes, you will see some drop-off, that always happens, but it's not the kind of drop-off that people fear. Most voters aren't voting at all in odd numbered years, so the drop-off is 100%, right? It's like there's no voting at all. When a local race moves to an even year, though, it gets to hitch a ride on the coattails of the federal and state races. And so it draws more voters, because if you're already invested in voting, you're already going to fill out that ballot. Most people just keep filling out the ovals. And this doesn't mean, by the way, that they'll be making an uninformed choice. Our research has found that most people make use of the voters pamphlet. And of course, we know the voters pamphlet has all of the races in it. That's a complete document. You might get more than one pamphlet, but when you put the pamphlets together, you will have basically a complete guide to the different races. So that's the top source of information for most voters, according to our research. And we verified that in King County, Pierce County, Snohomish County, et cetera. Voters do love that voters pamphlet. Other sources of information that are important to voters would be like information put out by the league, mass media, endorsement guides from political parties, and conversations with friends and family. Those are like the top sources of information according to our research. We know that sometimes cities have special elections in even years because they're allowed to do this by current law. And when that happens, we can actually measure what's the turnout in the city special election that appears at the bottom of the even year ballot, and how does that stack up against the regular election that they would have in an odd numbered year. And here's an example from the city of Olympia. So the top right here on this slide, the top measure is City of Olympia Initiative number 1. This is on a presidential year ballot. It's at the bottom of the ballot. The initiative was to create a city income tax and use that to fund college tuition. As you can see, this measure, even though it was at the bottom of the ballot, it drew 26,120 voters. And you can see that the measure was defeated by 52% of the voters. Now let's look at the bottom of the slide. This was a measure that appeared on the ballot the following year. Same universe, City of Olympia. Same kind of thing. It's a ballot proposition. It was a public safety levy. And it was even higher up on the ballot. But look, only 13,799 voters participated in voting approved or rejected on this public safety levy. That's like half of who voted in the previous year for that City of Olympia initiative. So just by being on an even year ballot, that City of Olympia initiative on creating an income tax drew twice as many people. And that's really surprising, I think, for some to see that, because it sort of goes against their notions of, well, people aren't going to vote when they get to the bottom of the ballot. But as we can see here, a lot of people did. Let's look at another comparison. In Seattle in 2020, which was a presidential year, there were 439,805 ballots counted. You can see the turnout percentage was 88%. And in 2021, there were only 267,414 ballots counted. So the turnout went from 88% down to 54%. And in 2020, there was a proposition, Seattle Prop 1, which is a transit levy, and there were 415,062 ballots cast for and against that. The next year, there were only 264,426 ballots cast for mayor. So mayor is like the most important election in Seattle and gets a lot of press and attention. But because it was on an odd year ballot, hundreds of thousands of fewer people voted for that position than they did on a transit levy the previous year. So that's the power of being on an even year ballot. Another example would be my hometown of Redmond. You can see that in 2021, we had 12,748 ballots counted. Turnout was a measly 37%. But in 2022, 1 year later, which is an even year and not a presidential year, but just an even year, a midterm year, we had 21,430 ballots counted. So the turnout percentage was 63%. So a lot more people voted on a Redmond public safety levy because it appeared on the ballot in an even year than they did for the candidates for Redmond City Council, which is at large, in an odd year. So now we've looked at 3 examples, 3 different cities, and we can see over and over again it's the same pattern holding. So we hear sometimes that moving to even year elections will drown out local issues. This is another case where it's a paradox. Local issues are already getting buried under the system that we have. And people don't know there's an election. They don't know if they should vote. We hear this all the time at the doors. Canvassers report that people are unaware of what's going on. They've not heard about the local election, and they're not planning to participate. And since more people vote in even years, local issues are paradoxically likely to get more discussion and attention if a local jurisdiction moves its elections. How can that be? Well, remember, voters are totally capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time. So if you add local issues to the mix in a state and federal year, yes, it's more to keep track of, but voters do it. Because when you're already dialed in and paying attention, the amount of energy required to add something else to the pile is a lot less than the amount of energy that it takes to start caring about the election to begin with. So an example of that would be King County in 2020. They had a bunch of charter amendments. They had like 8 of them. And each of those charter amendments drew a lot of interest. There were some arguments for and against. And in the end, a lot of people ended up voting on them, even though they were being asked to decide, something that is a ballot measure. It's something that pertains like whether we should have an appointed or elected sheriff was one of the changes that was in there. So these are things that, you might have to think about, but voters did think about them. They did vote on them, and they participated to a much higher extent than they did in the county elections a year later. So our professor, Franzoli, his response to the local issues will get buried argument is as follows. And this is the perspective of a researcher and an academic. He says there's little hard research on voter knowledge of local races in odd versus even year elections. Some research shows that the voters in even year elections pay more attention to local conditions. One study found no significant differences. In even years, candidates and organizations have incentive to inform many voters instead of working out to turn out just a few. Fewer media outlets are covering local elections, but at least media covers the fact that even year elections are happening. And I'm sure you've all noticed that. So we also hear the argument that ballots would get longer. It is true that ballots would get measurably longer if all the localities that we have in Washington were to move their positions. But the data shows that voters would rather have longer ballots in even years than the system we have. One solution for keeping ballot length in check would be to start appointing some governing bodies. So do we really need to elect the drainage district commissioner who always runs unopposed, every year or every 4 years, going on 3 decades, right? Maybe we appoint that body instead and then actually paradoxically get more oversight over it. And I think, given what King 5 uncovered with that drainage district like down in King County, that's a really good example of a poster child for having an appointed body. We're getting towards the end here, but let's go into a couple more arguments. So annual elections, we hear encourage people to get into the habit of voting. Sadly, this is wishful thinking. Most people don't care about voting every year just to make it an annual habit. As you heard me say earlier, it's been over a decade since a majority of voters returned a ballot, and that's despite all of our voting reforms that we've done. Voters just don't want to vote every year. We see this in our research. People say, I'm willing to vote, I believe it's important, but please don't make me do it up to 4 times a year every year. It's really important to give people a breather in between elections, and we hear that people would like to have some time off from having to vote. So, going back to that idea of much earlier in our history of, yes, we vote 1910, 1912, 1914, 1916. That's the cadence people want, is every 2 years. You've probably heard the term off year. I fight against this term all the time. My staff and I don't use it, but we hear it all the time. And in fact, last year, there was a national broadcast on election day, and I heard a reporter say, that asked a question of somebody, and they said, well, what do you think of the turnout in this off year? And I just cringe. It's just, if it's an off year, people are going to think their vote doesn't matter and they don't need to turn out, because after all, it's an off year, right? Our view is that every election is important. Every year is an on year. There's no such thing as an off year. Yet that term persists, and it leads to people thinking that their vote doesn't matter sometimes. We also hear that it will cost local candidates more to reach voters in an even year. This is true if you're going by radio and TV, and maybe to a lesser extent, direct mail and mass texting, assuming that a typical campaign is choosing to communicate with a large universe of voters. But the most effective means of voter contact for any local candidate is doorbelling. Nothing beats the doors. And aside from printing more copies of doorbelling literature, it won't cost more for a candidate to doorbell in an even year. They might be targeting a bigger universe of homes, but with a good volunteer team, you can do that. Voters' pamphlet statements don't cost anything, so there won't be an increase in expenses there. We also hear that less frequent elections would create staffing issues for county auditors. Auditors are indeed accustomed to the system we currently have because it goes back over 50 years. Some fret that if we move, it will make it more difficult for them to recruit staff to open, process, and tabulate return ballots when we do have a big election. We think this is a solvable concern. The state can provide more resources to support the auditors, and odd years can be an opportunity for increased training and testing. And we can use elections infrastructure potentially for things like publicly funded, taxpayer-owned public opinion research. So imagine in the odd year, you might get a survey at your home asking you what issues are important to you, and it would be then tabulated like a ballot, but you get to weigh in and share your opinions through, an official survey that your city might sponsor. And that way your city leaders can learn what's important to you, and you get the convenience of filling out your survey at home and sending it back and having it tabulated by trusted elections officials. So this is a concept that I've discussed with some auditors, and they're really interested in it. So our legislation, we have actually two bills now. The House bill is 1932, the Senate bill is 5723. The Senate bill only concerns cities and towns. The House bill concerns more levels of local government, including ports and special districts. The basic idea, though, is that we change state law to allow local governments to move their elections to even years, but we don't require it. Cities could do it councilmanically. That means through a vote of their council, or they could put it to a vote of the people at their option. The switch would be accomplished by electing positions to shorter bridge terms, like King County is already doing. And in the Senate, this is prime sponsored by Senator Valdez. House Companion has been introduced by Representative Farivar, but there is actually the bill moving through the House is sponsored by Mia Gregerson, because there were two House bills, an identical companion to the Senate bill and a slightly different House bill that Mia Gregerson introduced. Mia's bill 1932 is now the vehicle. 5723 was heard last year. It was exec and it's in Senate rules. 1932 was heard this year. It was exec. It got out of House rules and it's now on the House floor. So our primary interest in focusing on cities and towns to begin with is that cities are the most important unit of local government, and they're not allowed to be in even years now. So they need state law to change. All cities and towns being locked in, even first-class cities, we must change state law in order to help them figure out a way to switch. So if we're able to do this, if we're able to pass either of our bills, then again, we only need to pass one of them, and then the other chamber would vote and send it to Governor Inslee. But if we pass this legislation, cities and towns that want to switch, and potentially some other local governments, could start doing so beginning in 2025. By the end of the decade, we would have data to compare the turnout between older municipal elections in odd-numbered years, plus the newer ones in even years. Since nobody lives in more than one city or town, and because terms are staggered, the ballots wouldn't get much longer if we just did the cities and towns. If we're doing other levels of local government, then we have to account for those as well. But I don't think everyone's going to switch all in one go. We're going to see some brave jurisdictions go first and do some pilots. And then after that, we'll see, how that shakes out. But no defaults will change. No one will be forced into even years. One of the most important benefits of letting cities switch or other local governments is racial equity. This bill can be a meaningful and important follow-up to the Voting Rights Act. Our research has found that more candidates who are Latino ended up running for office and winning office in California. And that's one of the states that has already been doing this. And they've had a lot of success with the turnout doubling and diversifying. Here I've put up a couple of pie charts. You can see the mix of the electorate in even years is much healthier. There's a lot more young voters turning out. I mean, look at the share of young voters younger than 40. In even years, it's twice what it is in odd years. And you also see that it's healthier with respect to the group in the middle as well. So if we want young voters to influence the future of our local government, then having the elections for the cities and towns and other local governments in even years will bring out young voters. And of course, better policy outcomes. Research has found that even year elections have desirable ramifications with policy outcomes. So that reduces the influence of special interests and makes the policy more in line with what constituents want. So there we go. I would love to take your questions.
Okay, Andrew, I have one from the very beginning. And I'm just wondering, could you give us an example of that you mentioned jungle primaries and open primaries? Can you, I think it was for presidential, I'm not even sure right now, but I'd like a state, what state is an open primary? Iowa or a closed primary? Iowa? Just
Are,
something.
are we asking about presidential primaries or state and local ones? Because that's different. Those are different.
Okay, maybe could you explain the difference? Because I was kind of like, jungle caught my attention, but can you just give me an example?
Yes. So states with the jungle system are Washington, California, and Louisiana. Most states have an open or closed system. Like Oregon has an open primary with party registration, but you can switch your registration, of course, and you can change which party you're affiliated with if you want. But basically, like in an open primary, let's say you're an independent, you want to vote in the Democratic primary, you can do that. You just pick the Democratic ballot. You're allowed to vote in their primary. In a closed primary, independents are not allowed to choose that party's ballot unless they register it with that party in advance. So that's the difference between a closed and an open system. Oregon was our neighbor, and they have basically the opposite of what we have. A presidential primary is different. In Washington, the parties will ask you when you get your presidential primary ballot, they'll ask you to attest that you understand that you're choosing to affiliate with them when you return your ballot. And so the presidential primary is unique. It's called a special circumstances election, but it's actually not an election at all. It's a nominating event. And that means that when you vote for president in the presidential primary, what you're really doing is you're saying, I want the Democrats to allocate delegates to this candidate that I like. You're not actually voting for a person, you're voting for an allocation. So if you vote, let's say you want Dean Phillips or Joe Biden on the Democratic side to get delegates in Chicago, well, then you fill that in their name. And then the Democrats will say, okay, this many people voted for Biden, so he's going to get, most or all of our delegates. This many people voted for Phillips, so he'll get this amount of delegates. Phillips would need to clear a minimum threshold. If he does that, if he gets 15% or more, then he would get some delegates. If he doesn't clear that threshold, he won't get any, because those are the rules. But again, in a presidential primary, it's not an election. It's very misleading when the press call it one, because it's not, but you're really voting for an allocation at a national party convention. And that's something that I think even most journalists are not aware of. And it's kind of a struggle to educate them because they're so used to covering elections. They think of it as an election, but it's really part of a nominating process.
I'm not sure, and I can't. Let's see. We do have. Okay, well, thank you. I think I was thinking of harking back to just the recent presidential primaries, and Iowa would be an example of a
caucus state.
Oh, it's different.
Iowa's a caucus.
Okay, caucus state. New Hampshire would be an example of a jungle
primary. Not a jungle primary, just a primary.
Right, jungle primary. Okay, I think I understand that then. Thank you.
Yeah.
That was just a new term and I was very interested in that. We have one question from the chat and then I will get on to the people who have raised their hand. And Aruna wanted to know, do we need more voter education about the importance of local and state elections? Because the voter guides are often confusing. So would more education about the importance of the off-year elections counter? That's what she's aiming for.
Yes, the answer is yes, it would help. But even if we do more voter education, which we should do, getting people to turn out and vote in an odd year is going to be really tough. People just don't want to do it, and it doesn't seem like any amount of money or organizing is going to change that behavior. And again, we've not seen odd year turnout surpass a majority in Washington since 2011, nor do I expect that to change in the future. There's just no evidence that suggests that people will change their habits. So if anything, the turnout is probably going to get a little bit worse. We're getting to the point where we're almost hitting what I would consider to be rock bottom. And rock bottom, I define to mean people who will return a ballot no matter what. because it comes to them and they're good voters. So these are the people who, get their special election ballot in February and they're going to return it, even though there's no media coverage of the election and they can only rely on the voters pamphlet and there's no other information. Those voters are democracy all-stars and they are the most dependable people. So if you look at the average special election turnout, we've looked at it and it's like between 25 and 35% or so. Regular odd year election turnout is now approaching a convergence with the average special election turnout. So after we reach that convergence, it can't get much worse than that, because people who are going to return a ballot no matter what, we can expect that they'll probably keep doing that in the future. So if we hit rock bottom, then it's like, well, we're probably just going to stay there for a while, unless of course we change our system and start shifting some elections to even years.
Andrew, could you stop your screen share so we can see you?
Yep.
Questions? We are doing questions, but okay, that was Aruna. Thank you so much. Please, if you can look at the chat, you can see a little more explanation. And Cindy put in more information on the main presidential primary. They're going to be using ranked choice voting in their presidential primary for the first time. Anyway, let's get back to questions. So Laura, would you like to unmute, please, and ask your question of Andrew?
Yeah, Andrew, I'm curious, at least from my perspective in Kittitas County, the odd years are like nonpartisan. School boards, city councils and stuff. What do you think the impact of them all being together will do?
I'm not sure what happened to the.
Making these races more partisan.
I think I understood your question, even though there was an interruption in the connectivity with Zoom. I think you're asking what happens if races move from an odd year cycle to an even year cycle. What does that do in terms of like the partisan mix and the dynamics with partisanship? Because many local positions are nonpartisan and many state and federal positions are partisan. Is that right? I'm gonna guess yes. So one thing that's interesting is
yes.
A lot of counties,
yes.
they have partisan positions. Almost all city and town positions are nonpartisan, but adding them to an even year ballot, you might think, well, it's just going to nationalize everything, but actually voters think local issues differently. They think about them differently than national and state issues. And of course you can have candidates doing joint campaigning at different levels. Like you might have the Democratic Party, for example, might say, well, we're going to do a joint canvass with these city council candidates and these state and federal ones. The Republican Party might do likewise. But I think, if you peel back the veneer of nonpartisanship, you'll actually find that most cities and towns are very partisan. And I don't mean Democrat and Republican. What I mean is just simply there are fault lines in that city or town. Some of the nastiest partisan politics I've ever seen has been in a nonpartisan city council. Cities like, Gold Bar and Sammamish come to mind, where there have just been the worst, most drawn out, ugly fights between city council members and warring factions. And so just because a council is nonpartisan doesn't mean there's no divide in the community. And so actually, paradoxically, I love paradoxes. Putting races that for local in an even year might actually help soothe some of that nastiness, because you're taking, instead of it just being a small universe of voters who might belong to some of these warring factions, you're bringing this local environment into the state and federal mix, and that's a larger universe of voters. And so then you, instead of just having to try to go out and find the people who already agree with you, you're campaigning in a larger universe. So more people will be aware of the issues in the city and town, or the port, or whatever it is, and then they have an opportunity to get engaged and meet the candidates. So that really broadens the universe that these local candidates have to campaign in, which could actually help with, I think, some of the dynamics in these places where there's just a lot of nasty, petty vindictiveness. I mean, this is just a hunch on my part. I don't have like lots of hard data that people's interactions with each other get better when there's this larger universe, but in my experience, when more people involved, that's a good thing. The smaller the group that's sort of running a jurisdiction, the more concern we have, because it's not democracy when it's the few, it's democracy when it's the many.
Thank you.
Marilyn, why don't you go ahead with your question? Thanks, Andrew.
Oh, okay, let's see. I don't think I'm muted. Am I?
You're fine.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I can hear you.
Thanks, Andrew, for your presentation. It really helps. But my question is, I remember in 2016 going to a caucus event, and this was for the presidential election, which was, ended up being Hillary Clinton against Donald Trump. Why did we have, I don't remember ever having a caucus before for the presidential election. What was that in that particular year? It wasn't like a primary. I physically went to one of the high schools in my area and caucused with a group of people, which was really interesting experience.
You're quite right. In 2016, the Democratic Party used caucuses to both allocate and select their delegates. And so your memory is superb, and you just perfectly described what happened that year. The Democratic Party historically used caucuses for allocating their convention delegates. So that meant that if you wanted to influence how many delegates each candidate would receive, you would have to go to like a gym or a cafeteria or somebody's house, and you'd be there for a few hours and you'd fill out some paperwork. And then you talk with your neighbors about who you wanted to have nominated for president. And then at the end of the day, the party would tabulate all the preferences, and they would say, well, Hillary Clinton got this many and Bernie Sanders got this many, or Obama got this many and Clinton got this many. So the history of caucuses in Washington state Democratic politics goes back decades. After 2016, there were a lot of people who were upset about how poorly run some of the caucuses were. And part of the reason the caucuses were poorly run is because the volunteers just couldn't keep up with all the people who were coming in. My local area, they rented out a giant field house for the caucus, and they packed it. And like having volunteers run logistics for that whole operation, it's just a lot of work for those volunteers. So we asked, after that experience, we asked people, what would you prefer? And most people who were weighing in on the plans for 2020 said, we'd rather have a primary. Now, that doesn't mean the caucuses have to go away. It just means that we don't use the caucuses for allocating the delegates anymore. Instead, allocation is done through a primary. So in the primary, people express their preference. And then in the caucus that gets held later, you actually get to go to the meeting of the party in your area, and then you get to help elect who goes to the convention if you are so inclined. But this means that if you just want to vote for, let's say, Bernie or Hillary, in this case, you wouldn't have to stand at the back of a gym for 8 hours. You just fill out your ballot, mark the oval for who you want, check the box saying you understand that you're affiliating with the Democratic Party, at least for a moment in time when you are doing that, and send your ballot back. Much easier than standing in that gym for 8 hours. So the change was made because Democrats listened to the concerns that people had. They didn't get rid of the caucuses. In fact, there's going to be a bunch of caucuses this spring. The Democrats are holding them. The Republicans just held their first caucus a couple weeks ago in January. They held their first step. So they're holding caucuses and conventions too. So you can participate in either party's caucuses and conventions. They're still being held. They may not be as well publicized as they used to be because the primary is now being used for allocation, but we're still having caucuses on both sides to elect delegates and also to do other party business like approving party rules and writing a platform and so on and so on.
Okay, great. Thank you. I sure appreciate it.
And the problem.
You're welcome.
Problem with that, the caucus is if you can't be at that place at that time, you don't get a voice. And then the problem with the mail-in ballots that we had for the two sides in the 2020 election, Republicans had one choice. The Democrats had about this many. And if you were a really on the ball voter and you filled out your primary ballot for the one person you could choose and send it in and found out that your preferred candidate had dropped out of the race, your vote did not count. And that happened, didn't it, Andrew, to about 400,000, a quarter of the Democratic voters in the state had their ballots just basically placed in the trash can because they had voted for that one person who had dropped out of the race, before ballots were counted. So ranked choice voting, folks, think about it. Anyway,
Yep.
Let's go on to Chris, and then we have Karen with a question as well. Chris, go ahead.
So Andrew, thank you. These have been really well answered, and I love the way you're covering things. But I did want to go back to Carol's question about the jungle primary. And so I'm going to say what I understand it, but basically our top two, as well as Alaska's top four, and the future final five plans for other places, are called jungle because none of the candidates are actually part of a party per se. They get to just say what party label they want to be identified by. And so all of the candidates are all put together in one big group that you vote on. And that's why they call it a jungle. Does that seem right?
Yeah, that's a pretty good explanation of it. The system, I think, is first used in the system we have was first used in Louisiana, and then after we adopted it, California borrowed it as well. I don't like the top two system at all, and the reason I don't like it is because it disenfranchises voters in the general election. If you don't participate in the jungle round, you go to the general election ballot, and you're left with only the two choices from the elimination jungle round. And so, like, let's say you live in Eastern Washington and you're a Democrat. Well, you might see two Republicans on your ballot because those are the top two vote getters, but you won't have anybody on your ballot that shares your values that you can vote for. So you would have to write in a candidate. And then in like a place like Seattle, the Republicans are locked out. There's nobody on the ballot who represents their values. So that's not a great system for voter choice. And so I would personally like to see us have a real primary and not a jungle system. I think that would be better. We actually, in 2004, Carol and Cindy mentioned how far back my roots go. But in 2004, we worked with the league on opposing the initiative that created the top two system. It wasn't implemented until 2008 because of court rulings holding it off. But we actually opposed the initiative that created the jungle system, saying that it was going to hurt voter choice, and it has. If you look at, now this is happening even in statewide races. There was no Republican on the ballot for Secretary of State in 2022. There was no Democrat on the ballot for treasurer in 2016. There was no Republican on the ballot for lieutenant governor in 2020. These are statewide races. These aren't just legislative races. So it would be better, in my view, we can either abolish the top two thing altogether and do ranked choice voting in the general election, as some have proposed, or if we keep the preliminary round, we can go back to having a real primary, and voters who want to identify with a party can hopefully use again ranked choice voting or an alternative voting method to winnow down the field of candidates. That means that you can vote for more than one person. I see no reason why we should lock people into voting for only one person. But the system we have is not producing it's not producing government that's more reasonable, as some have argued. Like, well, you do a top two system, you're going to get more moderate results or centrism or something. There's no data that suggests that's true. The top two system can actually produce more extremes, because then you have a choice between one person who's really good at, like, maybe they have a field of 10 people and they got the plurality of the vote, and then the next person is also like kind of extreme. Like that system just doesn't guarantee any kind of moderation or centrism or anything like that. So when people try to make that as a selling point, like, I just kind of laugh. It's just there are advantages, I suppose, to the jungle approach. Not any that I agree with, but the idea that you don't have to pick a party. Some people are really enamored with, well, we don't want to ever have to pick a party. Well, then you always have the option of not participating in the primary if you don't want to pick a party. But some people just are like, we can't ever pick a party, so we have to have a system that allows us to winnow the field without having to pick a party. But I think the system we have is not serving us terribly well. Obviously, voter turnout is not super high in that top two round. It tends to be very low, actually, and so the turnout isn't superior to like what we see in other states that have a real primary. So it's not superior on a turnout basis either. But I think your description of what we have is basically on the money.
Watch out, Andrew. You are getting very close to thinking we should have proportional representation using ranked choice voting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Karen, your question, please. And then we have
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, Andrew. Thanks for the information. And I don't think I missed this, but I'm thinking about sort of the volume of what an election would be if we moved to every 2 years, just the number of people. And I'm thinking about educating voters, and I'm thinking about forums and all of that, associated work that has to happen. Have you given any thought, or is there thought to say, if you have, and this is our election year, that you have various elections throughout the year, so that maybe you do, as an example, local elections in the spring and other elections in the fall? Is there any, is there any thinking about that, so that then your emphasis is on its election year, and we're going to educate you throughout the year for the various elections as they come up, but we're going to stagger it a bit throughout the election, biennial year. Any thinking about that, or thoughts, comments about that?
Well, Karen, we actually used to do that. I mean, Seattle used to elect their mayor in presidential years in March, right? So they do it before the November general election. And so with respect to like, are people thinking about it now? I mean, a little bit. I think most of what people are focused on is this idea of we should have our local elections at the same time we have the state and federal ones. I think that's most important for two units of local government, counties and cities. And the reason that that's most important for those is because those particular local governments make a lot of important decisions that affect our lives, land use decisions, transportation decisions, public safety decisions. Other levels of local government are more specialized. So for example, the port is an economic engine for a community, but it's not making like giant, land use and transportation and public safety decisions, maybe a few, because some ports run like airports and there's public safety and traffic implications there. But by and large, most of the key decisions that would affect our lives are being made by county and city governments. And as you heard, counties are already in even years, except for Snohomish and Whatcom, or moving to them. So cities and towns is like, that's the one where I think we really benefit from having those on a November even year ballot. With respect to all the rest, like school boards, ports, it might make sense to, if we want to avoid a 2-page ballot, to have those special districts get elected in an even year, but earlier in the year. And that could be like a warm-up act for the November general election. I mean, I'm flexible in terms of like, how do we address this? And I think that's a really interesting idea. We know we used to do it, as I said, so why not explore that? Because in an even numbered year, people have not told us we're only willing to vote once. What they've generally said is we want a year off in between when we're doing our voting. Because, in the presidential year, you're going to have to vote in the presidential primary in the spring if you want to influence the party's nominations. And what we saw in 2020 was actually a majority of people for the first time voted in that presidential primary. And that was because both parties were using the primary for the first time, and it mattered, at least for the Democrats.
Well,
So
I'd love to see some. I'd love to see some maybe thoughtful polling around that idea. Again, and you have school district budget issues and all kinds of things. So I'd love to see, as you think this through, I'd love to see some polling and thinking around that.
We will definitely try to write a poll question about that, because I really like that as a possibility for solving some of the issues with ballot length, because I don't think we're going to want to put every last thing on a November general election ballot.
Hey, there have been a couple of comments in the chat about thinking that ranked choice voting might improve that jungle primary. So it's good to hear. Joanna, I'd like to hear your question now, please.
It's not so much a question, and I'm not making a pitch for one way or the other, but some things to think about, like being the fact that we're nonpartisan doesn't mean we're anti-party. So think about that. And one of the things the top two did was eliminate any third parties from ever making it to the general election or any election, basically, because it's just the top two. And when most international people think about proportional representation, it is by party. It's not some other kind of thing, which is quite a bit, and that's a parliamentary system. So I just want us to be thinking, well, do we want parties with different philosophies to be on the general election? So
again, somebody's kind of making a case for proportional representation.
I'm not making, but the one that we're talking about isn't necessarily by party, and I think it's a lot more complicated if you don't do it by party. So,
okay, thank you, Joanna.
Those are great observations. And other countries, they're very accustomed to voting for the party, not the person. The candidates sometimes get swapped in and out before the election, and people don't really notice. I mean, it's just like, who do you want to lead the country? Like in Canada, Justin Trudeau, for example, I want him to lead, so I vote for the Liberal candidate in my riding. A riding is a district in Canada. And so that's just a different philosophy. If any of you ever have a chance to go to Canada during an election season, do, because you're going to learn so much from their media and their people when you're up there. It's just fascinating.
I see we're really at the end of our time, And I want to thank you so much, Andrew, for being here today. It's just been a lot of information and all of it's been, very informative. I appreciate your time and energy with us. Next week, we're going to be having the Center for Responsible Forestry. The director is Brel Frobe, and he's going to be coming to talk to us about the role of forests in our climate situation and just, what makes Washington, keeps Washington nice and green. And I know I need information about that, so I'm looking forward to that. That's half of our program next week, and the other half, right now, it's to be determined. And we have a couple of different options out there, and so it's going to be a surprise for the other half of the program next week. Hope you'll be able to join us. And thank you again, everybody from all these different places across the state for joining in with us this morning. We appreciate your participation. See you next week.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.